Hello, I'm Richard Gold, and I'm very honored to be closing out this workshop on the TRIPS waiver. I'm an intellectual property and innovation professor at McGill University's Faculty of Law, and I work in the area particularly of partnerships and open science partnerships. And I'm going to talk to you about how do we make medicines and vaccines more accessible. I'm going to start at the end with a conclusion. And I've got 3 points to make here. The existing models of innovation not only fail to address problems of access and affordability in much of the world, as we've seen in the pandemic, but also are becoming increasingly inefficient. So even in areas unrelated to medicine and particularly unrelated to developing countries, the system is still inefficient, and I'll come back to that. And one mechanism to address this is the Open Science Partnership. That represents a mechanism through which we can lower the cost of doing research and development. And if carefully structured, can also lower the cost and increase access to what we develop, particularly important during a pandemic. So let me give you the general picture, and I'm sure you've seen versions of this slide from our world in data indicating who has had access to vaccines in the world. And we see that in general, high-income countries have done relatively well. I put Australia in there as well. It's done a little bit better. Canada's actually done a little bit better than that. But high-income countries in generally between 1 and 2 doses, 73%, and even upper middle income countries have done fairly well, not far behind. But when we go into lower middle income and low income, we find a problem, especially within low income countries. And I give you 2 examples from Syria and Ethiopia, indicating the very low availability of vaccines. We can see it also on this slide, where we bunch up the countries where they have the most vaccines. And we can see from low income down to high income that there are a whole bunch of countries at the very low end of access in low income countries. Lower middle income are spread. Some don't do too badly, but a lot are unable to access medicines. Upper middle also spread out, but having a higher rate of countries able to access drugs, and then high income countries really at the upper end. There is a scale depending on a whole bunch of domestic factors, but generally they have been able to access vaccines. This problem of inequity comes at the same time as we're having a problem in the innovation system in general. And that's really what I want to speak to about. And the 2 problems are decreasing productivity of our innovation system and increasing costs. And these 2 happen in parallel. So there are a whole bunch of figures I could give you, but this simply illustrates it. So if you look at the green line, these are the number of patent applications filed in the US per $1 million spent. We can also do the same by person. So that's the blue line decreasing. And the red line indicates an increase in cost per scientist. So for every scientist we are spending more and more. It's not only that we have more scientists, but each scientist is costing us more. We can also look at this differently by time period from 1920 to 65. For example, we can see in the United States that the R&D expenditures per technical person not only was rising, but rose exponentially. And we can see it on the back end when we actually put products on the market. The cost for each approved drugs between 1970 and 2010, based on some studies by Damasi, have increased and again increased exponentially. So some people have problems with the methodology used. I'm not looking at the absolute values here, but at the trend. They have consistently measured the cost of drug approval, and it has gone up. We can also look at the consumer end. This is the median monthly cost for cancer drugs in the United States. And again, we see, while it fluctuates, a distinct upward curve in terms of cost. We can look at this overall in overall systems. So Bloom and colleagues had a paper that came out a year ago looking at research productivity overall. The blue line is indicating our productivity. As you see, it's declining. And the green line represents one aspect of cost, that is the number of researchers. We can look at it more particularly for new drugs. So for each new molecular entity, again, productivity declining, but cost measured by the number of researchers increasing. This mixture of decreasing productivity and increasing cost means we get still a lot of goods, right? We pay more to basically stay in the same place. This is the Red Queen syndrome from Alice in Wonderland. So we make up for the loss of productivity by spending more. This is not sustainable. And as a reaction, both firms and academics react to this increased cost and lower productivity by lowering their risk. And they lower their risk by, instead of trying breakthroughs, which are high risk, maybe high payoff as well, but high risk, they move to lower risk research. That is, they find an incremental piece of knowledge that they can add to existing stores of knowledge rather than deviate and try something completely new. And one interesting example of this is the family of kinases. So there's a fixed number of kinases, and what Edwards and company did is they ranked each kinase by the number of papers on it. And so the blue lines are from 1950 to 2002. So ranking all kinases by the number of papers written on them from left to right on the x-axis. Now, if companies and researchers were out there doing really breakthrough knowledge, instead of researching the same kinase, they would go into the white spaces called the dark genome, where we have uninvestigated targets. Now, most of those targets won't work, but some of them will. And when they do, they'll pay off in a significant fashion. Well, they went 7 years later in 2009 and looked at the distribution of papers. And while there are certainly some looking at novel areas, for the most part, they map onto the same research targets as existed in 1950 to 2002. So they're not breaking away, they're doing more of the same. If you're an academic researcher, this makes sense because you want to get your publications out. But if from a societal point of view, this is inefficient. We can also look at this in terms of the similarity between drugs over time. So this is looking over a period of 1999 to 2013 or so. And we see that over time, pharmaceutical companies are putting their efforts into Me Too drugs rather than breakthrough drugs. Again, this is a strategy to limit risk. Where the risk is too high and the cost is high of investigating a completely novel type of target and drug, firms will go back to something more reliable. The payoff may not be as high because it's not a breakthrough and there are existing drugs in the market, but they're more assured of success. Why might this be happening? And I'm going to go through some explanations. These are not complete and certainly not mutually exclusive. The first is simply the complexity of science, that the easy targets of research were done a long time ago, often by a single researcher using minimal equipment. All those early discoveries came at a relatively low cost. But as we plumb the depths of knowledge and we try to extract ever more from Mother Nature, it costs more because we're doing more precise measurements, we need bigger teams, etc. So one trend is simply the complexity of science. Now, there's a caveat to this, because if that were the explanation, then how would we explain new fields where really researchers are uncovering truth for the very first time, so they don't have to go to the depths of knowledge to be able to do this work? And even in those areas like nanotechnology, biotechnology, and so on, AI, we are seeing the same trends that of lower productivity. So this is not a complete explanation. The second explanation is that we're using the wrong incentives. We only have one incentive for firms generally, and that is a patent or other form of intellectual property. So we put all our eggs into that basket. And on the academic front, we search to put our papers into high impact factor journals. Both of these have problems. On the patent side, if I tell my manager, get more patents, and they're facing higher risk and cost, they're going to do research that will generate a patent, but a minor improvement over what existed. They're not going to branch off into some other field where they may or may not get a patented product. They're going to stay with the tried and true. And so there's an incentive to actually decrease the risk involved with research to do more Me Too drugs. And that's what we saw in previous charts. On the academic side, by searching out high impact factor journals, what we're really saying is we want you to publish in journals where for 2 years after publication, because that's how we measure impact factor, you get the most citations. Well, there's research that indicates that in fact, really breakthrough research takes 5 to 9 years to really show the type of citations that compares with the big hit, but for a controversial but fairly minor piece of new knowledge. So we encourage our junior researchers and researchers in general, and in some places universities, to publish articles in journals by making it a small increment of knowledge, but really hyping it up, rather than do something completely new and people don't know how to cite it for a period of time. So both of these incentive schemes move firms and academic researchers away from high breakthrough type of innovations. That's a second explanation. The third is an increasing reliance on knowledge silos. So rather than share knowledge and each one builds on each other, we put them into separate silos, and this imposes a cost. Let me just give you one example. Firm A investigates a drug and takes it through phase 1, maybe phase 2 clinical trials, and finds out it's a dud. It's not going to work. Well, they don't share that knowledge if they can help it. And so they just park that knowledge and nobody knows about it. So company B comes along and looks at the same drug and does the same research and finds it's a dud, and then company C, et cetera. So each company, by not sharing knowledge, actually increases the cost of the entire system. If company B and C were able to know that, oh, that drug's not worth pursuing, the cost of innovation would go way down. The other aspect of this is as we draw on large data sets in order to draw conclusions, as we plumb that data, we need large data sets, and we need them large and of a certain quality. When we silo knowledge, we do two things. First of all, we don't put them together, and so the data we have available for our research is less powerful. But the second thing is there's no incentive to actually put them in the same format. And so even if we had access to different data, they're not necessarily compatible, collected in the same way. And so the cost of putting them together is very high. So these are just 3 costs or 3 implications of the system we have. Higher risk, higher cost leads to a more conservative approach to research, and the reliance on siloing makes it worse. How do we get out of this? I don't have the magic bullet, but one model that we're working on is the Open Science Partnership. And these are collaborations usually between a public and private sector, could be multiple public sector, but usually involves some mixture of public and private. What they aim to do is bring in a greater variety of knowledge. And how do they do this? Well, they have standard form agreements without any patents. Patents are one of the things we know that takes the most amount of time to negotiate, especially between a private sector firm and a university, even between 2 universities. It can delay project startup by 6 months or a year. Getting rid of intellectual property saves that. So one aspect of the Open Science Partnership is that whatever we do together goes in the public domain, eliminating the costs of negotiating agreements and making standard form agreements more feasible. The other thing it does is it shares knowledge. So each node in this network can access the knowledge, and by working together in a partnership, we can help define the kinds of knowledge we want, develop standards so that this knowledge is actually interoperable. On top of that, we share tissue samples if it's in medical research, research tools such as software, and other reagents and assays that are needed to conduct research. By lowering the cost of entering into these partnerships, we can get a larger variety of firms and actors to be involved. Large firms are willing to take the cost of negotiating IP agreements with universities, but a small firm will just stay away. By getting rid of that, we make it possible for a greater variety of firms to participate. And we know that by doing so, we get a greater degree of diversity of technical skill, hopefully also of cultural and other elements. And that increases the probability that you're going to get a breakthrough. What we also do through open science is we can have partnerships of partnerships. Because it's all open, different nodes can have a set of actors around it that interact. So we could have an open science partnership operating in Canada, but in conjunction with one in Australia, in conjunction with one in South Africa. And by developing common standards, and again, lowering the cost of participating in these partnerships, we can share knowledge faster and we get the power of the knowledge accessible to all. The other thing about these partnerships is that they offer a variety of incentives. So we talked about the patent incentive for firms, we talked about citations for individual universities or academics, but we can bring in more. We can bring in government that might hope to solve the pandemic, to make sure that other countries have access to it. We can bring in philanthropies or patient organizations. Each one has a different reason to contribute. When we combine all of these reasons, we get away from a monolithic scorecard, and we have multiple incentives. And so people putting money in can draw the research forward, even into areas that are higher risk. So let me just give you some examples of this. One of the first really open science partnership with all these characteristics of no patents, open sharing of data, but also of materials and tools, is the Structural Genomics Consortium. It's a UK charity with a variety of campuses, the main ones, the largest ones being at Oxford and at the University of Toronto in Canada. And the CEO actually sits in Toronto. Originally set up through the auspices of industry, GlaxoSmithKline in particular in 2003, the SGC has grown in size. Its original goal was to find the 3D structures of proteins that serve as targets for drugs. So understanding the shape of those targets allows firms to design the drugs that they want to use. So the SGC moved into this area. Originally, about a quarter of its funding came from industry. It's now higher, and published their results to the world at the same time as members were able to get the information. There was still a lot of value, though, to the members because they had a say in identifying the targets. They didn't pick it themselves, but they could suggest them. But they also got to work with this community of researchers and help define the standard or the quality standard that comes out of it. It's such that the quality standard produced by SGC researchers, mostly in university labs, is of such quality that there is no problem of reproducibility. In fact, large pharma firms rely on it without requiring further evidence of reproducibility. So that's a huge cost saving by just agreeing on the quality of it. And then there are all kinds of benefits from simply networking and finding out who is doing what. Since its beginning, the SGC has moved into developing chemical probes that could be used for drug research. These are not patented. In fact, one could order these probes through the SGC structures at cost with a small profit for the firm that's actually producing it, but not a patent level of profit. The SGC over time has moved into drug discovery and have set up a series of companies under the aegis of the Agora Open Science Trust, which is a charity. It owns for-profit companies, but these companies are developing business models that don't rely on patents. They use data protection and other means. So they're radically sharing the knowledge. Anybody could use it. They're not patenting it, so they're not preventing other people from either using the same molecule and taking them through clinical trials or slightly altering them, but using the knowledge that comes out of it. And yet they still have a business case. Another example is at the Montreal Neurological Institute, which is an institute and hospital attached or affiliated with McGill University. In fact, much of the staff is made up of McGill University faculty. It, as the name implies, works in the field of neurodegenerative diseases. And in 2016, it announced it was adopting an open science platform, meaning no patents on anything they do internally or with their partners, and a sharing of data. They spent a lot of resources building the sharing infrastructure for the data, for IPS cells and other things. And at the beginning, it was uncertain how successful this would be. It was set up as an experiment. The Neuro has 60-some labs, ranging from basic science to clinical work, and it was uncertain how industry would respond, how this would appeal to researchers, would researchers leave, how would funders feel about it? Well, 5 years later, we're seeing a massive increase in philanthropic donations. Firms are coming to the Neuro with significant amounts of money. Students and staff want to study at the Neuro because it's open. Patients are more willing to participate in research and give consent to the use of their tissues because they know it's going to be used broadly. We don't yet have the end result. Do we have a new medicine? But we have all the ingredients that are pointing in a positive direction. Only time will tell once we have molecules and we can assess, were they helped by open science? Can we make a final assessment? But the intermediate goals set up for this experiment at the Neuro have been overwhelmingly positive, and they're rolling it out to other institutions involved. And this is particularly important in respect of neurodegenerative diseases because more or less there hasn't been much advance. There's been a new drug announced earlier this summer, but of uncertain quality. In fact, many people say not worth it. Its dangers are higher than its benefits. In order to break through that problem, the Neuro decided to try something completely different, and that was the Open Science Partnership. And then more recently, a group that I'm involved with called VIMI, Viral Interruption Medicines Initiative, which is a Canadian consortium, and it works with an international consortium called READY. There's a READY at University of North Carolina, and we're hoping to expand. Focuses on 4 areas of market failure. One is pandemic preparedness. Can we develop antiviral drugs for the next pandemic? We know which families of viruses are most likely to cause the next pandemic, and we can develop drugs that target how those viruses take over human cells, and we can interrupt it. We can take these drugs all the way to clinical trial, at least phase 1, and park them on the shelves. And once they're there and a pandemic breaks out, we can quickly move into phase 2, 3 trials and get drugs out in months rather than 18 months or longer, as we're seeing right now. This would have been a huge improvement. And we can do this in the open so that no country can say to another one, you can't access this. Anybody can manufacture it. We don't have to worry about an IP waiver because any group of researchers that are funded by somebody, governments, NGOs, philanthropy, can take this knowledge forward. Another area is antimicrobial resistance. Like pandemics, we know that our antibiotics are going to fail one day. We just don't know when. We can develop new antibiotics and park them on the shelves. This is an area where firms that have entered in the space have failed because of the uncertainty of when the market would exist. So for both pandemics, again, no firm is going to invest for a pandemic that might not happen for a long time and not be the virus they're working on. Same thing for AMR. There's a market failure here because nobody's going to invest. Two other areas are market failures simply because the market is not large enough, and that's pediatric diseases and rare diseases. So these are the four areas that VIMI is working in. It's not working in neglected diseases because DNDi and other organizations are, but there are linkages between them. And the idea here is building on the knowledge from the SGC and its business models, reducing the costs of doing research, which is part of the open science model. We think we can develop drugs that traditional methods don't. We can do it by reducing the costs that go into it and by increasing the efficiency of the scientific enterprise by sharing knowledge and developing international standards. Going back to my conclusion, how do we fix this problem, both for pandemics and access to medicines, but also more generally across innovation, not only health, but across the board? Well, what we need is to move from the single model based on patents. We tell universities, patent and then transfer, keeping your silos. We need to get rid of that. We need more competition in how we organize innovation. That is, we need more innovation in our innovation models. Open science represents one model. It is unlikely to be the right model for everything, but in competition with a more proprietary approach, we think we can show benefits and people will move over to it, not exclusively, but in competition. And that friendly competition between models should pay off by lowering cost and increasing efficiency. If you want to find out more, I've cited the article where I write about this. It follows the options at the bottom. What we really need to do at bottom is rethink how we go about organizing ourselves. We went through the first industrial revolution, single person tinkering, second industrial revolution, more industrial centers, but still tinkering, to the third industrial revolution, science-based. It may be time to rethink how we organize ourselves again, and the open science model provides one way of doing so. Thank you.